I'm just standing around talking. It's 9:32, and we've got a lot to cover. We are in Romans chapter 4 this morning, so we better get going. Romans chapter 4 is the chapter about Abraham, and we're going to remind ourselves of how it fits in the context. We looked at this marvelous paragraph, chapter 3, verses 21 through 26 last week, and saw all the theological terms that are in it, how significant it is, as it talks about God's turning away from his wrath, and we are able to have the manifestation of God's righteousness through Jesus Christ. Verses 27 through 31 are kind of a bridge. They go with that previous paragraph, but they're also setting up what we're going to be looking at today. And we illustrated that by looking at some of the connections between chapter 3, verses 27 through 31, and chapter 4. Very briefly, we're going to look at it in more detail today. So Paul talks about boasting. Do we have a right to boast before God because we have been justified through Jesus? Well, no, of course not. This isn't something that we have earned. This isn't something that we have accomplished on our own. This is all through the grace of God, the gift of God. He mentions back in verse 24 of chapter 3. We are justified by faith, not by works of the law. We're not under the law. We are now under the law of faith, he says. And then he starts very briefly talking about circumcision in verses 29 through 31. And he's already brought up circumcision previously in chapter 2. And what is the big deal about that? Well, this letter is written to Gentiles who are interacting with Jews. And because of that, there is some conflict, obviously. And Paul is gently making his way into that discussion. But he's going to talk about people who are Jews getting along with people who are Gentiles in Rome. One of the interesting historical factors is the Edict of Claudius in AD 49 that kicked all Jews out of Rome. And then in AD 56, 57, that's when Paul's writing this letter. Obviously, some Jews have made their way back to Rome, but who are some of the famous people who were in Rome who were kicked out of Rome and found Paul? A married couple, Aquila and Priscilla, had been here. All right, so we've got these concepts of boasting, justification by faith, circumcision, and uncircumcision. And then they make their way into chapter 4. Abraham had no right to boast before God. Abraham was justified by faith, not works of the law. And he goes into detail about that. Why is it not possible for Abraham to have been justified by the Mosaic law? It didn't exist. All right, we've got that. We looked at Galatians with Larry teaching, and we saw that as well. 430 years separation between the law of Moses and Abraham, Paul says. And then he talks about the circumcision of Abraham. When was Abraham justified? Before or after circumcision? We're going to talk about that as well. To look at chapter 4, we're going to break it up into two sections, and I hope we will make our way through all of this chapter today. I don't want to go too fast. Don't want to go too slow either. But I want us to think about three concepts. In verses 1 through 12, he says that we are justified without works and without circumcision, just like Abraham. Without works, without circumcision. And then in verses 13 through 25, he says we are justified without the Mosaic law. He spends a lot of time talking about that. Without works of the law, without circumcision, without the Mosaic law, justified. So what are we justified? How are we justified then? Through Jesus. Okay. We are justified by faith. So he says this is what we're not justified by. Oh, by the way, let's remind ourselves what we are justified by. We are justified by faith. In verses 1 through 6, Paul mentions the term works several times. I see 4 times in verses 2, 4, 5, and 6. He also quotes from the Old Testament in verse 3, Abraham believed God, it was counted to him, it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And that term counted or reckoned, depending on your translation, is going to be used several times in chapter 4, specifically in verses 1 through 6, verse 3, verse 5, and verse 6. And the concept of belief, faith, those 2 terms are the same. I want to read verses 1 through 6 with you. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And then Paul explains a little bit. Now, to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted, reckoned as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. And then he quotes from Psalm 32. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. Why does Paul quote Psalm 32, verses 1 and 2? For one reason, it's because he uses the word count or reckon sin against us. He does not count or reckon sin against those who are in a right relationship with the Lord. Their sins are covered. This is dense material. I want to explain it in a way that is effective and help us see this, but there's a lot here. And so if you have a question, if you have a really hard question, just don't raise your hand. I don't want to hear it. No, if you have a question, let's talk about it. If we don't get through chapter 4 today, it's not the end of the world. And we're going to do our best to do that. Are we justified by works? No, we're not. The passage that Paul quotes is Genesis 15, verse 16. For what does the Scripture say? Of course, we're not justified by works because Abraham believed God. He had faith in God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. What's going on in Genesis 15? I think this is a passage that we're going to be rather familiar with. What happened in Genesis 12? What epic promises did God make to Abraham? Land, nation, and seed is what we often say. He says that you're going to be the father of a great nation. He doesn't say where, but they're going to inherit the land of Canaan. And it also talks about how through Abraham's seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. We're all familiar with that. That's why we're not going to turn to it for the sake of time. It also talks about Abraham being a blessing to all peoples. Through Abraham comes Jesus. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the nation of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob, and you jump ahead a couple thousand years, and eventually, through David, you have Jesus. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight as we start our Matthew study, the Old Testament and the Gospel of Matthew. We'll be looking at the genealogy, looking at David and Abraham. Well, Paul's looking at David and Abraham as well. Do you remember in chapter 1, as he began this letter, in verse 3, he's talking about Jesus, and he says that Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh. Well, here in chapter 4, he says, what has our forefather, according to the flesh, Abraham, gained? There's a really important connection between Jesus and David, right? We'll talk about that tonight. There is a big connection between Jesus and Abraham. Did Abraham father other nations besides Israel, the nation of Israel? Well, yeah, he did. He was the father of many nations. But what was the special nation? The son of promise, Isaac. The promises that were made to Abraham in Genesis 12 were passed on to Esau? No, to Jacob. So it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These epic Abrahamic promises were passed on only to this line, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Judah and the rest of the Israelite family. What was God's ultimate goal? To have a physical nation on earth that would last forever? He promised them they would if they didn't sin, but of course they did. But ultimately, it's that through Jesus, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Abraham's seed bringing about Jesus. That's what Romans 4 is about. Ultimately, it's pointing to Jesus, and we need to keep that in mind. Genesis 15, verse 16, starts telling us about Abraham's doubts. How old was Abraham in Genesis 12? When he received these promises, through you all nations of the earth will be blessed. You're going to be the father of a great nation. How old was he? He was 75. How many children did he have? None. How many children did he have in Genesis 15? None. And yet God is telling him the impossible. You, as a 75-year-old man with a wife who is 10 years your junior, Sarah was 65 years old. You're going to be the father of many nations. What? That's not possible. And yet Abraham believed God. And God's counted that. He reckoned that faith in the impossible as righteousness. Genesis 15, verse 6. This is not the only time it's quoted in the New Testament. Other authors pick up on it. Paul does in Galatians, James does, the Hebrew writer. We're not going to look at all those places this morning, but Genesis 15, verse 6, that should say verse 6 up there. Genesis 15, verse 6 is extremely important. Abraham's having some doubts, and God reaffirms the covenant with him. And here it's made its way in Romans 4, and it's only quoted here, but he keeps referencing it. And I hope that you will see that as we go through this. Okay, so look at verses 4 and 5. He's got a little comparison going on here. To the one who works, we're not justified by works, but the one who works, his reward is counted, it is reckoned as what? As wages. This is what the employer owes his employee. But then he compares that to Abraham and his faith. To the one who believes, his faith is reckoned, it is counted as righteousness. Now, is this something that is owed because Abraham believes God? No, this is not God's obligation. In fact, what does he say in verse 4? His wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. Well, what's the implication then? This is a gift. This is grace. It's actually a different term that Paul uses, but back in Romans 3, verse 24, he says, we are justified by his grace as a gift. And then we have this concept of gift here again in chapter 4, verse 4. We do not believe, and God says, oh, great, now I owe you salvation. This is a gift. We are justified by faith. We are saved by grace. And we talked about that last week when we looked at Romans 3, 21 through 26, that extremely important paragraph. Okay, so he's talked about counted or reckoned, and he keeps referring to Genesis 15, verse 6. What does Genesis 15, verse 6 say? This is your memory verse for today. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. If you don't already have that verse, that concept memorized, you need to have it firmly in mind, because it is so important, not just here in Romans 4, but elsewhere in the New Testament. Then here is the quotation: just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one whom God reckons righteousness, apart from works of the law. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. Did David have sin in his life that he was very glad he was forgiven of? David did something deserving death, didn't he? He had Uriah killed. He was responsible for Uriah the Hittite's death, and then he married the man's widow, whom he had already gotten pregnant. Sordid story. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit tonight in our Bible class. That word blessed, does it mean happy, happy, happy? Is that what it means? I'm happy. There's more to it. When we look at the Beatitudes, blessed are they who mourn, for their sins shall be forgiven. That word blessed, what does it mean? Yes, sir.
Could we say that when God blesses us, it's sort of like a special gift? We'll give
Yes.
a gift.
Yeah.
We can't give a blessing back to God. God doesn't need our blessing. But he does bless us. And it's something that we can't either acknowledge in terms of being able to say, okay, you gave me something, I'll give you something. The only thing we can give him is our heart. So when he blesses us, it's for our benefit regardless of what that blessing is.
And it involves forgiveness, it involves salvation, and that'll certainly make us happy. Sometimes you'll see in modern translations the term blessed translated as happy. Happy is the man. But it's more than that. And yes, we can bless other people ourselves. We can bless them with kindness and gifts. But number 6, that Aaronic priesthood blessing, the Lord bless you and keep you. We can do so much, and we do. We do a lot of things for each other, but what we really want is for the blessings of God to be upon those whom we love. All right, it's favor of God that cannot be repaid, and that's exactly what David was expressing. So verses 1 through 6 have several terms being used here. Works, and he's talking in the context about works of the law. Abraham was not justified by works of the law. He believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. We're talking about the forgiveness of sin. So we really covered verses 1 through 8. And now let's look at verses 9 through 12, the first half of what we're trying to look at. Do you have a paragraph break in verse 9? Some way your Bible indicates verse 9 is the start of a new paragraph? It's on the next page. Well, there you go. They just said, all right, we better put this over there. Because now he's going to introduce a new term, a new concept, circumcision. Don't you just love talking about circumcision? So we're not going to really think too deeply about what all is involved with the act of circumcision, but what is the significance of circumcision? It's about the covenant. Genesis 12, epic promises to Abraham. Genesis 15, the reassurance where God reaffirms the covenant. Genesis 17 is when Abraham receives circumcision. At the age of 86, when Ishmael has been born. He was circumcised at the age of 86. That's faith, folks. Okay, I said we weren't going to talk about circumcision. Verses 9 through 11. Is this blessing then only for the circumcised, i.e. Jew, or also for the uncircumcised, that is, Gentile? For we say that faith, there's that term faith, was counted to Abraham as righteousness. He keeps referring to Genesis 15, verse 6. How then was it counted to him? Was it before circumcision or after he had been circumcised? It was not after circumcision, but was before circumcision. Do you hear Paul's language here? He is laying a lot of emphasis on this idea of circumcision came after being justified. Genesis 17 is after Genesis 15, verse 6. He's making a big point about this. So we need to make a big point about it as well. Yes, ma'am. Yes, you're right. So Ishmael was 13. You're correct. I'm getting old. But you're exactly right. He was 99 years old. And then the next year had Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. So thank you for that. You're exactly right. I'm getting old. Things I used to just remember, I don't remember as well anymore. But that's right. All right, so Abraham's making a big point. Abraham. Paul's making a big point. Genesis 15 comes before Genesis 17. 15, Abraham believed God. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. 17, circumcision. So that's verse 10. Here's verse 11. The first part of verse 11. He received the sign of circumcision, Genesis 17, as a seal of the righteousness that he already had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The Jewish people adored Abraham. They worshiped him almost. Paul's not trying to take him down a notch, but what he's showing us is that Abraham's just like us. Or should I say, we are going to be like Abraham, because we also are going to believe and be justified by that belief, justified by faith. What was the purpose? The purpose was to make him, why was Abraham justified without circumcision? What was the purpose of that? The purpose of justifying Abraham apart from circumcision was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. And to make Abraham the father of the circumcised, who were not merely circumcised, but also, listen to this, who walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So, Abraham is our father. How many of you are ethnically Jews? Anybody here? Well, in the United States of America, there are many Jews who live here. In fact, there are more Jews in, I think, New York alone than the entire state of Israel. There are more Jews in the United States, but none are here. Aren't you glad that we don't have to become Jews or be Jews in order to be saved? We are justified in the same exact way that Abraham was. So when we're reading about Abraham and his justification, we're really reading about ours. And so he is established that we are justified without works of the law. We are justified without circumcision. Verses 1 through 8, justified without works. Verses 9 through 12, circumcision is just everywhere, and then it disappears. It was mentioned back in chapter 3, verse 30. God is one. God justifies the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised by faith. And then verses 9 through 12, he mentions circumcision, and then it's gone. Doesn't talk about it anymore. Any questions or comments you'd like to make on verses 1 through 12? Could we make more comments? Could we study a little deeper here? Yes, we could. But I hope we've made our way through the dense forest here of verses 1 through 12 unscathed. Before we leave it, just look at verse 12 again. God made Abraham the father of all. He is our father. And we are to walk in the footsteps of faith that our father Abraham walked through. I told myself I was not going to go over to Galatians 3, but I am going to go over to Galatians 3 for just a moment. Several times we would mention in our study of Galatians, Larry would mention that Galatians is sometimes called by scholars the little Romans, because Romans is 16 chapters, Galatians is just 6, and he talks a lot about Abraham, and he talks a lot about being justified apart from the law, being justified by faith. And it's in Galatians 3, verse 17 that Paul said, this is what I mean, the law of Moses, which came 430 years after Abraham, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. So he mentions this promise. What promise in Galatians 3, verse 17 is Paul talking about? All right, all nations of the earth will be blessed. And he also talks about a covenant. What covenant did God make with Abraham? The same promises we're talking about. That's probably all I should look at from chapter 3. Larry, it's hard to leave things out, isn't it? You want to keep going and going. Well, I want us to have in our minds the rest of chapter 4. So verses 13 through 25. And I also want to save some time for some application. We'll see how we go. Verses 13 through 25 now tell us we are justified without the law. We're justified without works of the law. We don't even need the Mosaic law at all, because he introduces a new term, promise. Promise. It is used in verse 13, verse 14, verse 16, verse 20, and verse 21. So that term promise has not been used, and now it is being brought in here. So when we are entering into a new little section, let's start reading. And I know you can't see it very well, but I've highlighted the word promise. So that word that you can't see, that's promise. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world, oh, these wonderful expressions, did not come through the law of Moses, but through the righteousness of faith. There's another reference to Genesis 15, verse 6. For if it is the adherents, let me start over. For if it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, what do we need faith for? Faith is null, the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. What he's saying is, when we try to adhere to the Mosaic law, it's not going to work. He's already established that in chapters 2 and 3. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. There's no knowledge of what we have done against God. But the promise was made to Abraham, then the Mosaic law, and so the promise to Abraham jumps over the Mosaic law. Our connection is not so much with the Mosaic law as Christians, but really with the covenant God made with Abraham before the Mosaic law. So we are not dependent on the law of Moses. And for us, that's easy. So yeah, we're New Testament Christians, of course. What about the Jews in Paul's day, though? They loved the law. They had been adherents of the law. And here's Paul now saying, you don't need to rely on the Mosaic law for justification. In fact, you can't. You can't be justified at all. So verses 13 through 15 tell us that Abraham is heir of the world. Well, if he is heir of the world and we are sons and daughters of Abraham, what does that mean for us? We are heirs of the world. What does that expression mean, do you think? He would be heir of the world. Physically, is he the heir of the world? He is the father of us all spiritually. And so he has passed on that legacy to us. Verse 16. We already read 13 through 15. Verse 16, and he's going to talk a lot about faith right now. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace. 3 important terms there: faith, promise, grace. That is why it depends on faith. What is it? Justification by faith. That is why justification by faith depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace. Our salvation depends on faith. Abraham was justified by faith. We are justified. We are declared righteous by faith, in order that the promise may rest on works that we perform, that we earn. No, it's all by grace. And be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, the Jew, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. That's actually from Genesis 17, where God institutes circumcision. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. Abraham is the father of us all in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Sorry, I got behind here. In hope, Abraham believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told, so shall your offspring be. He's introducing some new concepts here. He's establishing, look, folks, we are not justified by works. We are not justified by circumcision. We are justified by faith. Not just any faith, though. The faith like Abraham's faith, the quality of Abraham's faith. What does the denominational world teach about salvation? You can be saved if you just do what? Believe, because that's what Paul says here, belief. Romans 10, he talks about belief. We would say, well, we're also saved by grace. We're saved by the blood of Jesus that we access through baptism. But the faith that we are to have is not just simply acknowledging, well, Jesus, okay, he was the Son of God and he died for my sins. Great, I can go on with my life now. The kind of faith that Abraham had is of such refined quality, and we need to have that same kind of faith. It is an obedient faith. And that's what he's talking about here. Or really, it's not here that he emphasizes this. There I go again. In James 2, James there will talk about how Abraham was justified by works. The concept of faith only, being saved by faith only. We are saved by faith alone. Y'all hear that a lot, right? A lot of folks believe that. Where in the Bible do you see the expression faith only? It occurs one time. In James, when James is talking about Abraham being saved by works and not by faith only. Was Abraham justified by faith? Yes. Was he justified by faith only? He just believed. I believe you, God. Okay. I have no children, and I believe. look at how he further defines Abraham's belief. This man is the father of us all, verse 16. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. Genesis 17. In the presence of the God in whom he believed. Listen to this. God, Abraham believed, gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. What is he talking about there? That God gives life to the dead. And what do you think he means by that? All right, I am so glad you said that. Now, we could say, well, of course, part of that is raising Jesus from the dead, but that's not what he's talking about here. He is talking about Sarah's womb. How do I know that? Because of verse 19. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, as Antia corrected me, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. What happened in Genesis 17 when God instituted circumcision at that time?
She was still barren, but there was an issue with Abimelech.
Okay. Yeah, and Abimelech had been back in Genesis 12. When, okay. Abraham was called by God when he was 75. I don't have this on the screen. Abraham was called in Genesis 12. He was given those promises. Through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. He had no children. When he was 86 years old, Sarah said, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't you have a child, Abraham, so that we can help God out? He's promised that you will be the father of many nations. You have no kids, husband. So, I'm old. I'm 76 years old. You have a child through my Egyptian handmaid, Hagar. And they did. And so in chapter 17 of Genesis, when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. He's already made a covenant, but he's reaffirming the covenant. Abraham fell on his face, and God said to him, let me repeat the promises to you. I'm going to change your name from Abram to Abraham because you're going to be the father of many nations. And he talks about his offspring and how great that's going to be. So he reaffirms this covenant with Ishmael, saying he is not the son of promise. So who was born first, Ishmael or Isaac? All right, but which one is the son of promise? Isaac. How is it that Sarah, at the age of 89, going on 90, she had a baby at 90 years old? How is that possible? It's not possible. It's just not possible. In fact, in Genesis 18, when Abraham and Sarah are told you're going to have a son, what was the response of Abraham and Sarah? They laughed. What does Isaac's name mean? Laughter. All right. And it's just incredible that he is expected to have a great nation come through him from a son who was born to a 90-year-old woman. So I'm in Genesis 17 still. Verse 15. As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah you shall call her. Apparently her name means princess. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become many nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. What is Abraham expecting? He's got a 13-year-old Ishmael. And what does Abraham believe at that time in Genesis 17? Yeah, I mean, this is my son. And God says, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. I'm going to bless him. But the son of promise is the one that will come from you and Sarah, not you and Hagar. It must be you and Sarah. So what has God done? For 25 years, he made a promise over that period of time, you're going to be the father of many nations. And then he doesn't bless him with any kids. 13 years later, they helped God out when Abraham's 86, 75, 86. That's 11, 12 years. Why am I saying 13? I guess when he's finally born. They helped God out. And even then, they weren't helping God out, were they? Why did God just kind of lead him along? Make him believe, let him believe that Ishmael was the son of promise. To blow Abraham's mind. To make it absolutely ironclad clear that Abraham was blessed by God with salvation.
Not just Abraham, but Sarah too. She did not believe that.
Of course not.
Her belief was not even as strong as Abraham's.
Absolutely, absolutely. How do you think Abraham's faith was after he holds Isaac in his hands for the first time? The son of promise, by his wife. How do you think his faith was then? That's the kind of faith we need to have. So, let me finish. Verse 18. In hope, he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations. Has anyone here ever had that same kind of hope, that same kind of faith? In hope against hope. Do I need to explain that? Or have you experienced that? Do you know exactly what that means? Against all odds. This is impossible. God taking this barrier out of my life, helping me through this situation that I am facing. Against all hope, against all odds, Abraham said, I believe God because he said it. You see that bumper sticker? God said it. I believe it. That settles it. I always want to mark out that middle phrase there. God said it. That settles it. But I get it. This is the kind of faith that we need to have as well. In hope against hope, he believed. Why? Because God told him this is going to happen. Verse 19, he did not weaken in faith as he considered his own body, 99 years old, which was as good as dead. Remember, we're dealing with the God who makes things alive that were dead, since he was about 100 years old. Or when you consider the barrenness of Sarah's womb, which is dead. And he says that specifically in Galatians. So not only does God, going back to verse 17, give life to the dead, but he gives existence to things that did not exist. How was Isaac conceived? By a miracle. In fact, when Abraham and Sarah were told, you're going to have a son this time next year, they said, how is this possible? And the answer given was, with God, nothing is impossible. 2,000 years later, an angel appeared to a virgin teenager named Mary. And she said, I'm going to give birth to the Son of God. I'm a virgin. How is this possible? You remember what the answer was? With men, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. We're going to pick up here next week. I hope this has excited you this morning, looking at chapter 4 and seeing as we walk in the footsteps of our Father by faith and try to put ourselves in his situation. Let's make some application, more application next week to our lives as we think about Romans 4, the faith of Abraham, and then we will get into chapter 5. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.